In the heart of Portland, Oregon, stands a building people love to hate. In its nearly 40-year history, the Portland Building is probably one of the most divisive buildings in recent memory. When it was built, it rocked the world for its radical split with the sterile buildings everyone seemed to be making at the time. It also kicked off the Post-Modernist movement and launched the career of one of the most prolific architects of the 20th century. Today, it's seen as a tacky relic of the past, and is constantly voted one of the ugliest buildings in the world. But maybe the Portland Building isn't all that bad. I might be alone in saying this. I don't think the Portland Building is a bad building. It's just misunderstood, and should be celebrated as an important part of architectural history. Hello everyone, I'm Steve, an architecture student and writer, and welcome to All Things Architecture, the stories about the buildings and the people who created them. Now, on with our story. It's 1979, and modernism is still going strong around the world, and Michael Graves is considered one of the rising stars of late modernism, winning international acclaim for his designs. He's part of an influential group of architects known as the New York Five, and he's professor at Princeton School of Architecture. However, for all his acclaim, he feels that his buildings are too abstract for people to understand their underlying meanings. He searches for a new architectural path, and he casts his eyes towards a new style called Postmodernism. Postmodernism is in direct opposition of modernism. Pioneered by architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, Postmodernism was a callback to the past and classical traditions of buildings, with a modern flair. Postmodernism also strived to make buildings more inviting and more humane. This style, Graves felt, was an interesting new path to explore. Up to this point, Postmodernism was mostly an architectural theory, with only a few buildings built in the style. Also in 1979, after a lecture in Portland, Oregon, Graves had dinner with a young man who was setting up a competition for a new municipal building in Portland. During the course of dinner, he invited Graves to participate and submit a design. The competition was a tough battle. He faced pushback from architects in Portland who warned that an outside architect, especially one from the East Coast, would be overzealous in his vision and run over budget, kind of like a Frank Lloyd Wright type. Much to their surprise, Graves' design came wildly under budget, which made an impression on the jury. But there was another hurdle Graves had to overcome: experience. One of the biggest concerns the jury had was that he had never built a building of this size before. Philip Johnson, the influential architect and one of Graves' mentors, was on the jury and was able to quell any concerns they had. Ultimately, Graves won the commission due to the low construction cost and the radical postmodern design he proposed. There was no building in the world that looked quite like that. They broke ground on the building the next year in 1980, and the building was open in 1982. Now let's take a closer look at the design of the building. With the Portland Building, Graves is trying to establish a building that fits within the classical order of a building. He does this by packing the building full of references to traditional elements through symbolism. The overall order of the building is set up as a traditional building. There's a base, a middle or a shaft, and a top or capital. The base gestures to the street, both in its design, featuring a colonnade around the perimeter, as well as a well-defined entrance. Rising above the base, the main portion of the building is abstracted into a near-perfect cube. The concept of the cube is strengthened by placing square windows into the facade. On the building, the keystones call back to classic architecture, but Graves plays with their scale and sizes them up to 40 feet in height. Below them are abstractions of columns to symbolize the importance of a column in supporting a building. They also give the building some verticality that isn't expressed elsewhere in the facade. Originally, the building would have commercial office space in addition to the government space. The columns and keystones mark the change from government to commercial and symbolize the way government supports the rest of the city. On the other two sides of the building, there are highly stylized garlands. Garlands are often seen in classical architecture as an inviting symbol, and Graves carries this symbol over into his modern building to let people know that this building is a welcoming place. While those details create a historical context for the building, the colors help place the building within its civic context. For instance, the base of the building is cladded in green tile. This color refers to the park found across the street, and the off-white stucco of the main tower refers to the color of the city hall next door. The blue glass is similar in color to the curtain wall on the Congress Center adjacent to the building. Here, Graves is trying to create context by gesturing to the neighboring buildings to sort of fit in. Although the Portland building is in somewhat of a contrast, it isn't as stark as, say, Wright's Guggenheim in New York, which is a curvilinear form against a rectilinear city. With all of this, Graves makes one final nod to the past, and it comes in the form of a 39-foot-tall copper statue known as Portlandia. The statue was designed to be reminiscent of statues found in Rockefeller Center, like Prometheus, and was featured in early drawings of the building. Portlandia was sculpted by Ray Caskey and was inspired by the Seal of Portland, which features a woman called Lady Commerce. Graves renamed her to Portlandia. She's made of copper and formed around a wooden superstructure. It took some time for her to make it to the building, as she was added in 1985, 3 years after the building was completed. It's an enduring symbol for the city. It even inspired the name of the popular show Portlandia. For as rich in symbolism as the building was, it was built on the cheap. The city demanded that the building keep to a strict low budget. The results were several building defects that plagued it from day one. The building would go through a major renovation and restoration project in 2017 at a cost of $195 million. Despite the construction issues, the building was the hottest thing in the architecture community when it opened. It was given awards and featured in magazines, and overnight, Michael Graves became a household name. He would go on to design a number of buildings throughout the world and even design household products for companies like Target. As for the Portland building, it would light a fire of inspiration throughout the architectural world. For what Robert Venturi conceptualized in the academic world, Michael Graves brought it to the mainstream, and would remain a popular style for close to 20 years. For as much praise as it received, it had an equal amount of critics. People complained about the small windows and dark interiors. Another complaint was that the building featured details that had no functionality other than to be symbolic. To show their disdain for the building, one architect created a fake picture depicting the Portland building being blown up and crumbling to the ground. Another architect described the building as, quote, something designed by a third world dictator's mistress's art student brother. Tough crowd. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think the building deserves half the hate it gets. Sure, it has its flaws, and it's still not the best building in the world, and it's far from Michael Graves' best building. But it implanted an idea into architecture. Buildings didn't have to be sterile and shun history and whimsy. Instead, buildings could be connected to history, their communities, and the people who use them. And for that, it deserves a prominent place in architecture history. So is it a bad building? Not at all. Just misunderstood. And if you look deep enough, you'll see it in a different light. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing for more amazing content from the world of architecture. I'm Steve, and I'll see you next time with another episode of All Things Architecture.